Montana. 882. Go faster. Caleb. Morrison had faced a lot of things in his 22 years. He had faced a horse that threw in 3 times before he finally stayed on. He had faced a Montana winter alone, in a line shack with nothing but dried beans and stubbornness. He had faced a cattle stampede at 16 that had left him with a scar on his left forearm and a story he still told badly. None of it had prepared him for the front porch of the Reed Ranch. He stood at the gate on a Thursday morning in October with his hat in his hands and his heart doing something unreasonable in his chest, looking at the house where Frank Reed was almost certainly inside, and thought about turning around. He had thought about turning around every day for 3 months. Frank Reed was 55 years old, 6 feet and 2 in of Montana, rancher with a beard gone gray before its time and eyes that had the quality of a man who has seen enough to know exactly what he's looking at. The kind of man other men described as fair. What they meant was that he was fair the way weather is fair, consistently without sentiment and entirely without interest in what you thought about it. Caleb was 22 years old. He owned a horse, a saddle, a good knife, and approximately $14. He worked for wages on the Henderson operation, 6 miles east, which paid decently for seasonal work, and not at all in winter. He was, by any reasonable measurement, too poor for Frank Reed's daughter. He knew this. He had known it for the entire 3 months he had been trying not to fall in love with Annie Reed, which had been approximately as successful as trying not to notice the sunrise. He opened the gate. He walked to the porch. He knocked, and when Frank Reed opened the door and looked at him with those eyes, Caleb Morrison said the truest and most terrifying thing he had ever said to another human being. "Mr. Reed, I'd like to speak with you about Annie." It had started, as most things in Caleb's life started, with a fence. Specifically, the fence line between the Henderson property and the Reed property, which had a section that came down every spring when the creek flooded, and which in the spring of 1882 had come down on the Henderson side, which technically made it Henderson's problem, which meant Caleb was the one fixing it. He had been out there for 2 hours on a May morning, driving posts into ground that was still soft from the melt when he heard someone on the other side of the fence line. He looked up. Annie Reed was 19 years, old with dark wavy hair that she kept in a loose braid and the specific directness of a person who grew up knowing exactly where things were and how they worked. She was checking the Reed fence line, the section on her side which was also down, which meant she was doing her father's fence work on a Saturday morning without being asked, which Caleb noted. Anderson's side, she said by way of greeting. "Yes," he said. "We're down on our side too." She looked at the damage with the assessing eye of someone who has repaired fences before. "That post has been soft since last fall. Papa kept saying he'd get to it." "I can do your side too," Caleb said. "While I'm here," she looked at him with an expression he couldn't quite read. "You don't have to." "I know," he said. He fixed the Henderson side, then he fixed the Reed side. She brought him water halfway through, which he accepted, and they talked for 20 minutes about the fence and the flood and the Henderson kettle and whether the spring was coming early or late. And when he rode home that evening, he was already in trouble, and he knew it. He saw her 4 more times before June, always at some distance, always briefly. Each time he rode away, feeling like a man who had been standing too close to a fire and had not moved away when he should have. By July, he had stopped pretending this was going to resolve itself without his involvement. Ruth Reed had been married to Frank for 28 years and had developed in that time the specific skill of seeing things her husband was going to need 3 weeks to arrive at on his own. She saw Caleb Morrison the first time he came to the Reed property. Not to speak to Frank, not yet. just passing through on an errand for Henderson. That happened to bring him within conversation distance of the front porch where Annie was shelling peas. Ruth watched from the kitchen window. She watched him take his hat off when he spoke to Annie. She watched him listen when Annie spoke. Actually listen, not wait. She watched him laugh at something Annie said with a genuine laugh of a person who has been surprised into it. She watched Annie watch him right away. That evening at supper she said nothing about it. Frank was talking about the North Pasture and the price of beef in Billings, and Ruth listened and said the appropriate things and thought about a young man who took his hat off and listened. Annie was talking to the Henderson hand today. Frank said eventually. Ruth said, "Young fellow Morrison, I think," Ruth said. Frank looked at her. In 28 years, he had learned that Ruth's H had approximately 14 different meanings. And this particular one meant she knew something he didn't. What? He said nothing, she said. Pass the bread. Frank passed the bread with the expression of a man who knows he is behind on information and is not sure how to catch up. Ruth buttered her bread with the serenity of a woman who has already decided how the story ends and is simply waiting for everyone else to get there. October arrived and Caleb ran out of reasons to wait. He had spent the summer finding legitimate reasons to be near the Reed property. Fence repairs, cattle questions, returning a tool Henderson had borrowed from Frank years ago that Henderson had no memory of borrowing. Each time he saw Annie, each time the conversation was good. Each time he rode away, more certain and more afraid. In September, Annie had looked at him across the Reed kitchen table.
Ruth had invited him for coffee.
After he helped bring in a section of fence that had come down in a storm, which Ruth had engineered with the precision of a woman who knows exactly what she is doing, and said very simply, "You always find a reason to come by." "The fences," he said. "The fences are fine, Caleb." He looked at his coffee. "Yes," he said. "I always find a reason," she had smiled at him with an expression that was not a question. So he came in October, hat in hands, $14, and the particular terror of a young man who has decided to do the honest thing regardless of how it lands. Frank answered the door, looked at him, said nothing. "Mr. Reed," Caleb said, "I'd like to speak with you about Annie." Frank looked at him for a long moment. Then he stepped aside. "Come in," he said. They sat at the kitchen table. Ruth appeared with coffee that she had clearly already had ready, which meant she had been expecting this, which Caleb found simultaneously comforting and alarming. He said it plainly because he didn't know how to say things any other way. "I care about Annie. I'd like to court her properly with your permission." He looked at the table. "I know I'm too poor for your daughter, Mr. Reed. I don't have land or savings or anything much to offer except that I work hard and I mean what I say, and I would," he started again. "I would spend my life making sure she never regretted it." The kitchen was very quiet. Frank Reed looked at this young man, the worn shirt, the hat in the hands, the $14 visible in the complete absence of anything else, and said nothing for long enough that Caleb's heart had time to do several unreasonable things. Then Frank said, "She needs a good man, not a rich one." He paused. "But I'm not giving you my answer today." Looked at Caleb with those fair weather eyes. "I'm going to give you something first, and we'll see what you do with it." The something Frank gave him was this. The Harlan property, 8 miles north, was the hardest piece of ranching land in the county. Old Jim Harlan had died in August, leaving the operation to his son, who was 19 and had no experience and was going to lose the entire winter's cattle if he didn't have help. Frank had agreed to send a hand. "You'll spend the winter there," Frank said. "No wages. The boy can't pay. You'll work from October through March and come back in the spring." Caleb looked at him. "And if I do," He said, "Then we'll talk," Frank said, which was not a yes, which was not a promise, which was Caleb understood entirely the point. He said yes before Frank had finished the sentence. Frank noted this without showing that he noted it. Ruth, who was refilling coffee that didn't need refilling, noted it too and was considerably less subtle about her expression, which Frank chose not to look at. Annie heard the entire conversation from the hallway. She had not been invited to participate and had,